My guests are Tony Eprile and Judy Schwartz. Tony is an award-winning novelist, author of The Persistence of Memory, and has taught creative writing around the world, focusing on the art of observation. He is an amateur naturalist and photographer and has traveled widely, along with his spouse, Judy Schwartz, to visit sites of ecological restoration. Judy Schwartz is author of 3 books, including Reindeer Chronicles, which is a journey around the world exploring ecological restoration. Judy is the chronicler of the movement with which I identify, that is, those of us who believe that we have a livable planet because we have a living planet, that life creates the conditions for life, that climate is more than carbon, and that job number 1 is to understand how nature works and to work cooperatively within our living systems. Judy and Tony, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Glad to be here.
So we're celebrating the legacy of Millán Millán, a Spanish scientist who recently passed at the age of 80-something and was a great pioneer and contributor to our understanding of climate and weather. What would you like for people to know about Millán Millán?
Wow, it's a big question because he was a big person. If not physically, he brought so much to our understanding of how weather works, how our ecosystems function. So what I would love for people to know, I would love for people to know his work, his insights, his, I would say, courageous following lines of inquiry that he felt genuinely needed to be followed, that he wasn't following the herd. He felt really strongly that we need, that our understanding of how what we do to the land affects climate and weather was really, really important, even though he got a lot of pushback throughout the years. So yes, his insights, his incredible scientific knowledge. What does he have? 3 PhDs, something like that.
Number of patents.
A number of patents. Just the real intellectual curiosity that he embodied and that led to really important insights that it will likely take us a while to all absorb and unpack.
And I'm here because, along with Judy, I got to spend, I think, was it 4 days with Millán Millán in Valencia and driving up into the countryside, and really got to know his deep understanding of the culture of Spain, both the history and the peoples of Spain, a very deep family and personal connection, all related to us by someone who is a profoundly astute observer. And we got to see how Millán Millán, even if we were just sitting as we are now in his apartment, which has a view of the Mediterranean, would be looking at the clouds and explaining why the weather report was incorrect, because he could see what the clouds were doing and the meteorologists were looking at computers and instruments.
So tell us more about your trip to Valencia to visit Millán Millán.
Yeah. So this was when I was writing the book, The Reindeer Chronicles, and going to Spain was really important because there were many things happening in Spain. Among them, the beginning of the ecosystem restoration communities movement, the very first community, or as it was then called, camp, which is a couple of hours southwest of where, maybe due south of where, of Valencia, and then to spend several days with Millán Millán. And I say several days in part because we knew that we were going to be taking this journey, this kind of epic journey up into the country where we would be able to see what Millán Millán had come to understand, which was the reason for the loss of the regular summer rains. This was kind of the cornerstone of his his work to understand the profound ecological changes in the region where he was based, and that had huge impacts on regional weather and regional capacity. I mean, we hear now about heat waves and fires in Spain and encroaching desertification, and what he observed, which, to put very, very simply, and we can kind of unroll that a little bit as we talk, was that the loss of vegetation led to the loss of the regular rains. The loss of the regular rains led to heating, aridifying, and also that, and also the warming of the Mediterranean. It also meant that that moisture had to go somewhere, and therefore led to, as moisture moves, led to incredible heavy rains and flooding in Central Europe. I love a line that he often uses, which is that you cut a tree in Almeria and you get a flood in Dusseldorf.
And the irony is, when we arrived in Valencia, it was pouring rain. The place we were staying in, the walls were damp because it had been raining for days and days. It rained and rained in Valencia, but when we drove up into the mountains and the farming area, going towards Millán Millán's family home in Teruel, once you passed the city, the rain stopped. And that's exactly the opposite of how it used to be and how it should be if what you're hoping for is a vibrant, thriving countryside and people enjoying sitting in outdoor cafes in Valencia.
So talk a little more about how that works. What we do to the land affects weather and climate.
Okay, there are so many different aspects to this, but just one way of, in our conversations, and I said, so we spent several days with him. We planned on that, partly because we knew we were going to take this trip with him. It was past Teruel, a small village called Valbona, but also because, quite honestly, I knew it would take several days to try to make sense of everything that he was saying. So, to process that and to be able to say, okay, I think I understand what you mean. So, all right. So basically, the way that it had been was that in the summer, it wasn't the rainy season, but the summer regular rains created a bridge so that the upland areas and the farming areas would get rain, and so they could farm, and this is what happened. And so that there would be heat, then the clouds would come in, and then you'd get the rain, and then you'd get this wonderful fresh coolness. And he explained that most of the moisture for those rains came from the Mediterranean. However, the moisture coming from the Mediterranean was never sufficient to make a rain. There needs to be a certain saturation point. And the way it had always worked was, and you can mentally kind of apply this to one's own region, the way that it would work is that moisture would be transpiring from vegetation, from the grasses, the wetland areas, the marsh areas, and the forests. And then when the marshes were drained for development, when the forests were chopped down for hotels and residences.
And the Civil War, which was a big part.
Right, yes. That's true. Can't forget the Civil War, but also for to expand the farming areas. Then there wasn't enough moisture to be picked up to create the rain. So the moisture would keep moving and it would go up via the orographic phenomenon, and it would just move. And that's where you might get a heavy rain at some point. And, you know, as I said, in Central Europe, they've been seeing more and more heavy rains, even as the region in Spain is drying out. So the ecosystem functions that were keeping these dynamics in place, and that for people for hundreds of years had worked with, that was broken.
And I just wanted to add the part because of about the Civil War, because Millán Millán was very aware of what had happened. His family had been affected by it, and the Franco's nationalists had cut down the oak trees in that region because they were fighting essentially a guerrilla war, and they figured if they burn and cut down the forests, then the Republican military would have nowhere to hide. And later what happened is they planted pine trees, which are fast growing, but obviously do not have the kind of ecological function that oak trees and similar trees have. And this very much affected everything in terms of the water function, the wildlife. Millán Millán also was an avid mushroom forager, as I am. And so he was upset because, of course, oaks are the best for mushroom foraging. And one of the points was that this is how human activity and our politics and activities in terms of war affect the very climate we live in. I can talk more about that later, but I also wanted to add, at the time, I believe, was he director of the Mediterranean Meteor?
I think he might have just retired.
He might have just retired from that.
The Center for the
Environmental Studies of the Mediterranean or something.
The other thing that he pointed out is that because of the changing global weather patterns, the thermocline in the Mediterranean was much deeper and larger than it had ever been, which meant the turnover between warm and cold water was very much affected, which meant much more moisture on the surface of the Mediterranean. So you again did not have that effect where clouds of a certain density blow inland, encounter transpiration from the green fields or forests, and rain. The rain falls in the Mediterranean, or it falls on the city, which is not an agricultural base. Yeah. And one of the things he pointed out too were this is part of his sense of the history of Spain, both the Roman and the Moorish waterworks, which are kind of ruins. They're old, you see some old, I want to say bricks, but they're really kind of not really fortifications, but built up places to slow down water or to catch water, or various ways that both the Romans and the Moorish Empire understood and dealt with water. And by looking at what they built, you could also know what the water patterns were in previous time periods.
Yeah, when we took that drive with Millán, it was as if we were going backward in time, and he could look at an area and he could say, that's a new forest because it burned in 1970 because it was a monoculture pine, and because the aridification of that area. So we were going back from into the 60s and 70s, back to what happened during the Civil War. The Spanish Civil War in the 1930s, when not only, so there was the guerrilla warfare, then there were the fighters that were cold and were cutting down whatever remained of the trees. So going back, and Roman times, and the Romans were not innocent of destroying ecosystems either. So we really got this very, very rich sense of sins against the landscape.
So Spain, the Iberian Peninsula, is not what it used to be.
Yeah.
Yes,
that's what he was definitely making that point.
Although the point he also was making is that with good decision making, you could bring it back more to what it had been.
What would he recommend?
Yeah, so basically to understand the conditions under which the landscape would thrive, to understand how it worked in the past. He's someone that applies kind of an understanding of ecological forensics. What went wrong? How did it used to be? And what can we learn from that? So reforesting coastal areas. And then he added things like light-colored roofs so that you'd reflect the heat. Mainly it was strategic reforesting. He didn't talk about reclaiming the marshes, but I imagine that he would have included that. But what he did say is that doing that for a certain, I can look in my
I think
books.
it was like 22 hectares of land.
I just looked at it. It was like 35 miles elsewhere. Maybe it wasn't a huge expanse of reforestation that would need to be done, but it would need to be strategic. And then what he also pointed out is that you wouldn't necessarily know where the rain would return
Mm-hmm.
initially. So, but anyway,
he was an advocate of,
I'm going to take a look at this.
Kind of constant observation. And one of the things that seemed to infuriate him particularly is how a lot of the current scientists simply use models or prefer computer. They prefer to use these rather than their own eyes of seeing what's going on. And he was explaining to us, it's quite a complicated thing of how the models for the Mediterranean climate average things out rather than actually deal with the constant shifting and flux of winds and moisture and conditions. So I think particularly what he felt important to do was to understand how water works and not, for example, he pointed out a dam had been built, he said, in completely the wrong place. It should not have. It should have been higher up rather than where it was. It was built for convenience. The people that built it didn't understand what they wanted to do with the water and why. And the other issue, of course, were the trees and the planting of various green areas so that you get that transpiration that meets the right percentage where moisture turns into raindrops rather than continuing to blow different directions. Mm-hmm. I believe he talked where we were going. There were two climate regions where the winds came from. There's the Mediterranean winds, and then the winds coming from the mountain area.
Right. So we were at we crossed the continental divide, and he explained that was really important as to where the winds would come from. And
I'll also say when we're driving, he said, we'll be there in 20 minutes and it will be raining when we get there. And it wasn't raining, we could see it. And sure enough, as soon as we reached the place he said was raining, it started raining.
What do you think he saw that led him to draw those conclusions?
Clouds, some particular activity of clouds.
And he just knew the land. He knew what altitude we'd be at. He could tell the wind patterns. That is something I noticed again in his apartment. He'd be looking out the window and noticing how the clouds were blowing or how the light looked. And I think just years of being a scientific observer gave him a real sense of what the weather was going to do. And he was
Let's
correct at
talk a
the
little bit about his early life. I read just briefly that he had learned that sense of observation from his father. And then let's talk about why did he leave Spain and go to Canada, and maybe some of his early work.
So yeah, he had as he described it, a wonderful childhood. He grew up in Granada, and right in the a few neighborhoods up from the Alhambra, the famous Alhambra, and beautiful Moorish series of palaces that everybody has to go.
Yeah,
yes.
I was going to say he and his friends. I think his friends were. I'm not sure if it was his brother.
It was his friends.
They were. They liked to play soccer in the Alhambra itself, and they knew all the tunnels that ran underneath the Alhambra, so they would sneak in with no problem, and they would go and kick a soccer ball around this famous tourist site. And he just grew up in the really knowing that landscape and that history.
Yeah, and as a youth, he saw that life under Franco was not going to give him the freedom, the access, the intellectual, the possibility of really realizing his own intellectual, scientific potential. So he left. He went first as an exchange student to the US, and then he was able to study in Canada. And he returned a few years after Franco's demise, when he felt that there would be possibilities at home in Spain. He married a woman from Canada, Jackie.
And while he was in Canada, he had a couple of inventions. I think people know more that he actually is a person who came up with the invention that's now used in airports around the world, to the metal detector. That was from research he was doing. But he also, using I believe it was a gas spectrometer, he was looking at how you can tell the pollution coming from factories. And ultimately what happened with that invention was a very simple device to look at the kinds of gases in coming out of a chimney. That actually wound up being used by volcanologists around the world to tell whether volcanoes were going to erupt, because you could determine very quickly the amount of sulfur in the clouds coming up out of the volcano. And he said that particular invention was used until fairly recently as the primary determination, is this volcano on the point of exploding.
So when I read about him in Reindeer Chronicles, was a little bit confused as to what climatology and meteorology would have to do with metal detectors. But he spent a lot of his career studying the dispersion of particulates and pollution through the atmosphere, so that maybe that's part of the connection.
Right. Yeah, he also had a mentor that he spoke about a great deal, someone named Ted Munn. And Ted was looking at, so basically Millán brought us back to the late 60s, early 1970s. And at that point, people were looking at the potential for human activity to have an impact on the climate. And people were looking at greenhouse gases. People were also looking at changes in the surface of the earth, what happens when solar radiation meets the ground, and therefore looking a lot at land use change. So that's something that Ted Munn had written about, and it was really fortuitous. Millán told us about this particular publication. There was a meeting of scientists that happened at Williams College in Massachusetts, and MIT brought out 2 volumes, one in 1970, one in 1971, of the of the yields from these conferences. So that's about 25 minutes from us. So I headed down to Williams College and found that book, and indeed, it was that it was understood that what we do to the land can have an impact on climate, and that is something that we need to look at and understand, and that we as humans need to just be mindful of when we pave roads, when we build cities. And one thing that Millán lamented endlessly is that line of inquiry, that, he talks about the 2 legs of the climate, what happens in the atmosphere with greenhouse gases and what happens from land use, that they both be looked at. And he lamented that one leg had been forgotten, so that basically we've been hopping along on one foot as we try to understand what we're dealing with.
I remember you quoted him as saying, like, why do we focus on carbon dioxide at the exclusion of everything else? And he said that because you can focus on carbon dioxide for decades and not do anything about it.
Yeah, there was a deeply cynical side to him, born of decades of frustration, of not being heard. And what he said was that, yes, you can argue about carbon and not do anything about it, even though it can look like you do. You can make agreements, make pronouncements, as we've seen and as we are seeing. But when it comes to the land, who's going to tell this person you can't build a hotel there? That's when it gets personal. That's
Right.
when it gets real.
Mm-hmm. And he's very frustrated with bureaucracies. He never could refer to the water board without some rather rude epithets before mentioning the water board in Spain, because things also under Franco were very regimented and very bureaucratized. Mm-hmm. I would like to also use the opportunity just to talk briefly about that history. You mentioned his father, and one story that really sticks with me is that he described how his father's life was saved by the same Franco-nationalist officer who was behind the killing of Gabriel Garcia Lorca, Spain's national poet. And the story was, I forget exactly if the father was avoiding church or coming from church. I think he was avoiding church with a cousin. And as happened in the Civil War, they were just grabbed off the street, stuck on a farm truck and told, we're going to take you to a field and shoot you. And this officer came along and he knew Millán Millán's father. And he said, okay, you get off. And Millán's father said, well, this is my cousin. He needs to get off too. And the other guy said, no, just you. And he said, I'm not getting off unless he gets off. And the officer thought for a minute and said, okay, both of you get off, which really could have gone either way. His father could have been shot. Mm-hmm. But Millán said the same officer had really had it in for Lorca. I know Franco's people hated Lorca as well, and they probably would have killed him anyway. But this person had a real grudge against Lorca because their families had a long-standing feud over land and over the use of a waterway. So from Millán's point of view, the death of Lorca also had to do with the way people are battling over water resources. So that's quite a story. I've never heard it anywhere else, but he really, he talked a lot about his parents' connection to the history of Spain, and he was very aware of this. Also, the where near the place near where he has the family home, Teruel was famous for one of the worst battles in the Civil War.
I see. So what would Millán Millán say about what we should do? We have all this crazy climate, crazy weather. He has a perspective that has not been accepted by the mainstream. And what would he want us to do in order to heal the climate?
So I would say, as a, he was really the embodiment of a, true scientist. Ask the right questions, measure the right things, don't fudge numbers. And when I say fudge numbers, that isn't quite what he meant. He talked about how in modeling, sometimes you might average when you put in the figures, and when you keep averaging, then the discrepancies can become quite large. So
okay, I have a rant. This John Mearsheimer is a famous foreign policy expert. Agree with him, don't agree with him, doesn't matter. He's pretty bright, and he said that he said theories and models are necessarily simplified. So a simplified model is not going to, he said that a model is going to be wrong at least 20 or about 25% of the time. And so we have models, and we have this model about climate, and scientists don't seem to understand that it's going to be wrong part of the time. And what is it that we're not incorporating into the model? So what would Millán say about our modeling exercises?
One thing he said is that scientists forget that a model is not a natural system. They start to believe their models are what is real. And that was a big rant he had.
Yes, again, and being precise, knowing when the model is useful and knowing when you need to be more granular in the specifics before putting that into a model, before applying that.
Yeah, so the climate models, in my understanding, I think you talk about this some in your books. A global model cannot possibly account for all of the local phenomena, like the small water cycles, the tiny water cycles that occur, and the effect of that on the local climate, the regional climate, etc. So is that one of the things that's going on here, the failure to account for local phenomena because it's too complex?
Because it's complex, because that's not how our public conversations have gone. And Millán felt really, really strongly about the importance of understanding what's happening locally and regionally. And I remember vividly when we were talking about I'm just thinking, this was in, a few years ago. In that year, what were the big weather extremes that everybody was talking about? He said, what's happening now is not because there's too high a concentration of CO2 dispersed in the global atmosphere. I remember vividly, he said, it is local impacts going wild. And we're not looking at it that way. And what's so empowering is that when we look at things, look at phenomena regionally, and locally, then we can understand how we can address that and restore some of that ecological function.
So when you say local impacts, you're talking about what we do to the land, because land is by its nature local, whereas atmosphere by its nature is more regional and global.
Yeah. What we do to the land, and by extension, how we are impacting the hydrological cycle. And he felt very strongly that we have tremendous agency to address where it's dysfunctional now.
You also did talk about how private property affects that, because the impact in terms of weather in the change in land is not necessarily going to be felt on that piece of land primarily or initially. So part of what he talks about is that people have to realize how interrelated the different parts of land are, so that you need everybody thinking of this way. It's hard to persuade a farmer to plant trees on instead of a cash crop so that rain will fall, 20 kilometers away. So that was one point he made about the resistance to some things that clearly would change and would be helpful. Some of the resistance is someone wanted to build, I think we passed a wood pulp factory. And it's like, well, yes, it's there because someone is making a profit from this. This is not doing good to our environment, fragile environment as we've created it.
They're making a profit, but they don't have to pay the true cost. If they had to pay the true cost, it wouldn't be profitable.
Exactly. So Millán would talk about both from the cynical, frustrated point of view, and then he would talk about the ideal. And the ideal would be that we strategically reforest, that we apply our intellect and our curiosity to understand a region the way that he viscerally felt deeply connected to his region. So I would say that he would encourage people to really know where you are.
So, for example, if you would look at a place where the Moors had built a whole series of water channels, and that place is dry and arid, you will have to say, well, okay, what were the conditions that allowed there to be plenty of flowing water here? And so part of it was that observation of the history of looking at what trees grew here before, because we keep hearing about, oh, we're going to solve, climate problems by planting trees. Well, it makes a difference what trees you're planting.
Exactly.
And Spain was a great example because Franco's government just planted pine trees everywhere.
Right. And then
they're more
flammable
source of fire. They're, useful for timber, but not good for the landscape and not good for the soil on the landscape. So,
well, you mentioned the cutting down the oak trees. Oak trees are just probably the single biggest contributor to ecosystems especially in a temperate zone. But what was I going to say? So Anastasia Makareva, excuse me?
I was just going to add to the oak trees. One of the things he was very proud of was the truffles in that region of Spain, which had largely disappeared because the oak trees disappeared. But now that people were replanting oak trees and rediscovering the few oak trees left, truffle industry was coming back. And he was very disappointed the time of year. There were no fresh truffles in the place we went to have lunch, just the dried ones. But he was very hopeful that Spain was going to become once again a major source of truffles for both the regional cuisine and for the world.
Let's talk about how the different ways in which living systems impact the climate, and then go from there. Like this is my riff. This is what I keep working on. But living systems, not least of all forests, especially old growth forests. Anastasia Makareva, proponent of the biotic pump theory, says that old growth forests are very important and very different from like a tree plantation. But old growth living systems, especially old growth forests, they have an impact on evaporation, which contributes to the next rain. They have an impact on condensation because they contribute this particulate matter around which the water droplets coalesce. They contribute to cloud formation because they're putting all of this evaporating water and the condensation nuclei up into the air. And then you have precipitation. It's easier to precipitate into a cool, moist environment than into a hot, dry environment. And then the forest acts as a sponge. So the sponge holds onto water for future use, that and then you have the heat bank. If you have more water in a place that has more water in it, because it's a living system, is going to be slower to warm up, slower to cool down. All of these ways in which living systems regulate our climate, and if you cut them all down, we're going to have a more erratic climate. We're going to have more erratic water cycles, not enough rain when you need it, too much rain when you don't need it, that kind of thing. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you were saying that, first of all, I was thinking, I don't even know what to add. You're kind of running down all these really pivotal functions. But Millán was known for kind of crystallizing this in his aphorisms, which were water begets water, vegetation is the midwife, and soil is the womb. And you just described all of that. To build on that, so Anastasia Makarieva was one of with Viktor Gorshkov, developed the understanding, the theory of the biotic pump, in which that trees, mature forests will, transpire. They lift moisture into the air, and that creates a low pressure zone. So moisture is pulled. So it drives, it's a natural function of forests that moves moisture across the planet.
Here's my riff on that. When water condenses, it takes up 1,000 times less space. So the condensation process creates a vacuum. It's like collapse, whoosh, collapse, whoosh. And it's bringing in this air from elsewhere. In other words, from more places more remote from the forest. It's bringing in this air and engaging that air and the water vapor in a water cycle. That's how forests make rain. They don't just enjoy the benefits of the rain. Forests make rain.
And that is one of the factors, although Millán did not use that term, that he was observing with the Mediterranean, that there wasn't enough vegetation, enough forest to pull that moisture from the Mediterranean. And then, so the moisture was stuck there. And then he called it a kind of atmospheric traffic jam. So you get layers of moisture, layers of pollutants. And then that kind of created water vapor is a greenhouse gas of greenhouse gases that's heating up the Mediterranean, which then causes all kinds of other.
Right. So let me ask you about this. I've been kind of trying to understand the role of this haze. There's a haze, and correct me if I'm wrong about any of this, but there's this haze up there. The haze, what I'm talking about, Walter Jena talks about it a lot, and that is that this water vapor is a greenhouse gas. Scientists agree that water vapor is a greenhouse gas, and that the water vapor as a greenhouse gas creates most of the heating. They just not on board with the idea that we have an impact on the amount of water in the atmosphere that is a greenhouse gas. But part of this, there's this haze up there that tends to stay suspended because the particulates that around which the droplets coalesce, there's an electrical charge that keeps them apart so they don't condense. And you have this water that's stuck up there. What I have not heard that I suspect but don't know, and that is if we had functioning water cycles, then the trees and the forests would be putting the water vapor and the particulates in the air. You'd have cloud formation, you'd have condensation up there, and it would grab some of that water that's stuck in the haze. So if we want to reduce this haze and resolve some of that haze, then we need to get the water cycles going. I don't know that.
To understand that natural systems create the conditions under which they thrive.
Right.
I mean, that's how they've been perpetuated through time. That is what would happen. And what Walter Jena also said is that the dust from all the eroding soil around the world, that dust, particulate matter, they don't become hydroscopic precipitation nuclei because of the size, that they're too small to have that function. Whereas the aerosols that come from, from different natural functions, from trees, from ice crystals, all that, are the size that becomes, precipitation nuclei, and then we.
Is there a difference in the elevation? Does that haze tend to be higher, or is it the same elevation? Because if it's a comparable elevation to clouds, then it would stand to reason that if you have more forests and more clouds, that haze would get involved in the water cycle. But
yeah, I don't know. When you talk about the elevation, it calls to mind something Anastasia said about the biotic pump, that when heat is carried upwards, then that goes out to space and that's dispersed.
Mm-hmm. Right.
When the conditions are such that it doesn't go upwards, when the biotic pump isn't
mm-hmm.
pumping,
right.
then it kind of stays at a lower elevation and then is trapped by greenhouse gases. So that helped me understand the dynamic of the biotic pump in conjunction with greenhouse gases, and bringing that together helps us see that restoring the biotic pump will help release more heat.
So Walter Jena talks about how, and other scientists, the greenhouse effect is a function of the excess of incoming heat to outgoing heat. We have more incoming heat to outgoing heat, but the difference is only about 1%. All we have to do is deal with 1%, reduce the income or increase the outgoing by 1%, and then we wouldn't have a net greenhouse effect anymore. So, we talk about evaporative cooling. When water goes in through the roots, up through the tree, out through the leaves, then evaporates, that evaporation has a cooling effect. And then somebody might say, well, what goes up, what comes down? If evaporation has a cooling effect, then condensation has a heating effect. But the condensation occurs up there in the clouds, and some of that heat emanates back out into space. So that is I think it would be enough if the heat was transferred to a different place in the atmosphere. But it's more than that. It's heat is emanating out. Somehow heat turns into radiation. That baffles me, but it does. Some of the radiation is pointing outward. Is that consistent with your understanding?
I think so.
Mm-hmm.
Does that?
I think so. I'm thinking a little about it probably has, again, to do with moisture content, because the moisture will hold the heat like literally a wet blanket. Mm-hmm. I think that was one of the things Millán was talking about. He was really worried about the Mediterranean thermocline. And given that the moisture, instead of going out on the land and being dispersed, was coming back to the Mediterranean, you're basically having that wet moisture sitting over the Mediterranean and keeping the heat in. So that, and then you have below that, you have the water holding on to heat, because water retains heat for a certain period. And he said was retaining it, was much deeper, much larger, and retaining it for a much longer period. That causes a tremendous and often uncertain climate change.
And that's why we had the heavy rains when we got there, because right. Valencia is right there, at the coast. And then Millán said, and this was in late November, right. that, when the winds come and it cools down, then the rain will stop. He said, it's like when you blow on a, hot cup of coffee, that right. then it cools, that the cool air will finally do that. Anyway, I don't know. We just moved from a very significant question back to Millán's understanding of the Mediterranean. So I'm not.
Right.
Well,
so mainstream climate science says that there's this, yes, water is a greenhouse gas, but somehow carbon dioxide is responsible for the amount of water that's up there as a greenhouse gas. That carbon dioxide is the input and everything else is an outcome. What?
Yes, that the water vapor is a secondary effect.
Right.
Yes, that is how it's understood. But there are cracks in that narrative.
Tell me more.
Maybe it's because I'm in conversation with people like you and Alpha Low, and had been with Millán Millán, and all kinds of other people asking these questions, that I'm seeing more discussion than I did even a few years ago. And people asking I think people are asking deeper questions because they're concerned, because they're frustrated, and because because
okay,
they
here's another rant. The rant is that people who are wringing their hands about carbon dioxide and want to, think we should drop everything and deal with carbon dioxide don't have a plan for dealing with carbon dioxide. There's like Mark Jacobson is a Stanford engineer who has this modeling exercise, and Mark Jacobson's work is in every single Green New Deal. It's quoted and cited as authority in all the Green New Deals. It's cited as authority in all these local clean and renewable energy resolutions. But his own colleagues have pushed back against that. This was published in Proceedings of the National Academy of Science, and then Jacobson sued them, and he ended up having to pay attorney's fees according to something called SLAP, strategic lawsuit against public participation. But here's this very dubious modeling exercise that pretends to claim that we can lower carbon dioxide by switching to solar and wind and hydro. And here's the number of hydro dams we need. And here's the number of solar panels we need. Here's the number of wind farms that we need, all of which is completely unrealistic. Simon Michaud has been a great authority as to analyze, the mining engineer, originally Australian, and then he's in Finland now, has really rolled up his sleeves and said, how much materials do we have for all this? But where I was going with that is that the people who want to deal with carbon dioxide don't have a plan for dealing with carbon dioxide. Partly because you're not going to lower fossil fuels when you have a growing economy. Currently, the economy is perfect. The fossil fuel usage is perfectly correlated with GDP. So if you're going to rising GDP, you're not going to lower fossil fuel usage. Anyway, I just think you have to look at the source and look at the intellectual bankruptcy of the people who are claiming to have a solution to climate change.
I hear you.
Don't get me started.
Yeah. No, it is interesting. I don't know do you have a response to that? Because
Oh no, I'm just thinking about some local issues.
Exactly.
And a fight going on right now, which we're involved with. That there's a company wants to cut down something like 45 acres of forest to put solar panels up, using, of course, lots of government loan rebates and incentives and carbon credits, and they want to destroy what's a very unique, beautiful piece of land because it's conveniently situated near power lines, and it makes absolutely no sense. I keep saying, try to explain to a 4-year-old child how cutting down trees is going to help the planet.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So that in its essence sort of encapsulates what you're saying, that this is the tension point, that the system wants to continue, and everyone who's invested in the system, and
right.
The system wants to continue. but
it's not working,
yeah.
But we want to keep doing this, the same thing, and pretend it's going to work out.
Well, you have to look at the amount of, one thing you have to look at of many things, you have to look at the amount of mining that it takes to make a solar panel. Yeah, you have to look at the whole supply chain. And we're going to take mining, which is already ecologically destructive and already consumes a lot of fossil fuels in its own right, and we're going to double that. And to make solar panels and wind turbines, we're going, and every proposal for building a new energy system requires massive amounts of steel, concrete, and plastic and every conceivable metal. And so, somehow that doesn't get it reported on, it doesn't get incorporated into the models.
Right. So I was mentioning new roads because they want to build a road to get all the machinery into this place. So what is the environmental impact there?
Yeah, you have to look at you have to look at the mining, manufacturing, processing, transport, installation, repair and maintenance, and disposal of all this crap.
And the disposal reminded me of something Millán talked about also, is how short-term the thinking is in current modeling, because much of the modeling doesn't include disposal. These at best, these solar panels only last 25 years. And then what do you do with all these solar panels?
Yeah, solar panel is like any other technology. You've taken metals, you have alloys of metals, you have this, micro level plating, and you're combining things. But if you pretend to recycle something, you have to disaggregate that which has been aggregated. You have to separate that which has been combined. It takes a tremendous amount of energy. In the best case scenario, it takes a lot of chemical processes. It generates pollution. So,
yes, and trees are not merely sticks of carbon.
Right. So let's talk about what happens when you clear cut a forest, either for biomass energy, or you clear cut a forest for a solar installation or wind turbines. When you take a forest and turn it into a not forest, well, that not forest can't maintain the carbon in the soil. When you take out the trees, the soil is going to erode. The soil is going to degrade. It takes decades for the trees to grow back. And it's like, hey, these trees were going to die anyway, so let's cut them down now. That kind of thing. It ignores the value of dead wood. There's this whole thing that says, oh, we're just using waste wood. Well, economically, it's not viable to use only waste wood. And if you're talking about taking dead wood out of a forest, you don't understand the ecological value of dead wood. So,
well, one thing that I brought up in the public meeting about this project was that a couple of weeks prior, we had some unprecedented rains, heavy rains in July. And I talked about how the forest manages water. It slows down the flow of water down the hill. And so that we need to think about what the loss of that forest would mean from the standpoint of flood mitigation.
And what you're saying about dead trees really resonates. One of my go-to books is called Reading the Forested Landscape. And it talks about the role of the dead trees in maintaining the forest, and how, as observers, we can see that. I think that a lot of decisions are being made by people who never step foot in a forest and don't have an experience of what it's like and how it works.
Well, let's talk about the ecological value of dead trees. So, maybe it falls down like this, in which case it's going to take 30 years or so to decay and becomes increasingly absorbs water. It becomes a place where insects and worms and things can get water. So it becomes the beginning of a food chain in which birds and amphibians can get insects for food. And then if you have a standing dead tree, that's called a snag, it becomes a nest for woodpeckers. So the woodpecker makes its nest in the snag, and then that hole that the woodpecker made is used by some 80 other species, according to a study that I saw. And then this is how the dead wood. Even Michael Mann, I read Michael Mann has one of the this big shot climate scientist who wrote a book called The Climate Wars, had no apparent understanding of the harm of biomass energy plants, where you take trees, turn them into wood pellets, ship them to Europe, and burn like they're coal, and had no apparent understanding of the harms of biomass energy plants, and was defending it on the basis of their supposedly using waste wood, just completely defending the indefensible.
Well, I would venture that a lot of this is kind of a manifestation of our collective societal disconnection from nature.
And also our arrogance when it comes to nature, the desire, like we can do something. It's easier to cut up a tree than to leave it. And I'm just thinking about what you said, because we're looking down a slope here where we had a large spruce tree fell about 18 years ago, I think. And we had someone doing some work on the land. He said, "Oh, do you want me to cut it up?" I said, "No, leave it. It's still alive." This tree is full of birds. It's nests there. The tree is still alive. It doesn't look that great. It's lying on its side. But that fallen tree has been an absolute boon for bird life and squirrels and insects and everything. And it's, the human reaction was, there's a fallen tree, I should cut it up and move it. And we were like, no, just leave it. Let's see what happens. And we're very glad we did that.
So let's talk about, like, what would you like to see happen? What would you like to see that, that's different in the world?
Well, it can't be done in one, in the space of one finger snap.
Mm-hmm.
But, and again, thinking about Millán Millán and what he might say, to be courageous in your asking of questions, to be courageous in, I say courageous because it can be uncomfortable to learn that something is different from what you have heard. To maintain one's intellectual integrity and to connect with nature around us and find joy in it, because he did.
And from my point of view, maybe the one thing I'll do is get children outside, make being outside in nature part of your parenting, part of your school curriculum, just getting people to be aware of the world we live in and how much we're connected to it. And along with that, appreciating insects, because one of the frightening things is how we're losing the insect populations around the world, and they are absolutely essential to the functioning of plants, of every aspect of nature. So that would be my personal rant, is like, get out there and love some bugs. So.
Right. Well, that's a great place to end it. Thank you, Tony Eprile and Judy Schwartz, for joining me. But our audience, please check out Tony's book, The Persistence of Memory, and Judy's books, The Reindeer Chronicles, Cows Save the Planet, and Water in Plain Sight.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining me.